I want to welcome everyone to this episode. We're going to be talking about religious OCD or religious scrupulosity. And this is something that I think is very murky for many of us. It's kind of like, well, what is OCD and what is religious scrupulosity? And when we become Christians, we really want to get it right. At times, we can even become enslaved to precision, or we could become legalistic and so forth. And even when it comes to like OCD, you think about how our culture has sort of retooled whatever understanding around OCD. And at times it's hard to get a good understanding. And we've got an expert with us today. This is a licensed psychologist who studies diagnosis and so forth. Although she won't be providing any diagnosing today, she will be providing information as it relates to religious OCD or religious scrupulosity. So, Dr. Felucio, can you tell us a little bit about OCD?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me on today, Kyle. So with OCD, it's OCD is a mental health disorder. It's characterized by obsessions and compulsions. Okay, so we'll start by talking about the obsessions. And obsessions are recurrent, unwanted, and intrusive thoughts, urges, or images, right? And they cause distress. Not, they don't, anxiety is part of it, and anxiety is experienced for a lot of people. So we most commonly associate OCD with anxiety, but there can be also other unpleasant emotions and sensations that come with these obsessions and these recurrent unwanted thoughts. Feelings like shame, feelings like disgust, a sensation that something is just not right. And so to neutralize these uncomfortable recurring emotions, and I say uncomfortable, that's to say the very least, it's very distressing. And so it's for people who have OCD, it's impossible to just sit with that. So this is when the compulsions come in, and the compulsions are they're either behaviors or they're mental acts. And what they do is they serve to neutralize that unpleasant emotion, whether it's anxiety, shame, or disgust, or that sensation that things just aren't right. And so when you have the two of those happening, that's when we have OCD. And it is the obsessions and compulsions, for the criteria to be met, have to occur for at least an hour per day. But for people who have OCD, it's much more than that. And we often associate OCD with cleanliness, right? When we talked about Hollywood and the stereotypical images we see of people washing their hands, but the types of OCD, or the types of symptoms that can happen, are related to the types of unwanted and intrusive urges, thoughts, and images. So there can be themes around religiosity, the fear of causing harm to others, symmetry, several other things.
So, my wife and we are kind of like, I'm not going to say we're examples of this or anything, but like, my wife likes even numbers really, really big. So, for us, when it comes to anniversaries, she plans the even numbered years anniversaries, and I plan like the odd. And there'll be times like I'll be in the car. This is a crazy example, right? Well, I'll be in the car and I won't like turn the volume knob to where there's a six. I just have this weird, like if it's 6 6 or something, like weird stuff. Or I think what you're talking about is something a lot more controlling. It's not,
Yes.
like I think sometimes people have this idea of like, I'm OCD because I like order and I like to be organized, or I can't stand messes or whatever. But you're talking about something that's a bit more exacerbated, it sounds like.
Definitely. I mean, a common misconception about OCD is that it's an adjective, right? So people will say, "Oh, I'm so OCD about this." We all have certain things that we have particularities about, that we have our preferences. We even have our quirks. That's not what OCD is. OCD is not a disorder of quirkiness or preferences. It is debilitating. And so people who are going through this, they feel helpless to not perform the compulsions. And so when you think about, maybe someone may have a preference for numbers. Somebody who has OCD, they could be perhaps in the store for hours and hours and hours looking for something that comes in a particular set, right? Usually when people are experiencing OCD, it affects every aspect of their life. People are missing work. People sometimes can't gain employment. People's families are oftentimes, having to to work with people who are having these obsessions and compulsions because they've just taken over every aspect of their life. And so you can talk about it from a point of view of, this is kind of what I do. This is the thing I do, right? But with OCD, it is all consuming. It's taking over every aspect of that person's life, and it's causing a great deal of distress. Usually OCD doesn't appear by itself. We see depression, we may see other sorts of anxiety disorders, and it's a very serious, and it can be difficult to treat too. It can take people up to 17 years to get the right type of treatment for OCD. So you see people who are suffering in silence with this kind of disorder, because it's not well understood sometimes in the clinical community either. You have to go to somebody who knows what it is and is familiar with the different presentations of what OCD can look like.
You know, it's interesting. This kind of takes me back to my undergrad days, where I think I did a project as it related to, and we don't have to go down this rabbit hole, but OCD and body dysmorphic disorder, and that sometimes even the medications that are used, there's an overlap. And so, are there any other? You'd mentioned anxiety, or you mentioned depression. Obviously, this is an anxiety-based disorder. Likely, it's tied to high anxiety. Are there any, so body dysmorphic disorder, are there any other aspects we want to consider as we look at OCD?
Yes, generalized anxiety disorder can also be something that I see accompanying OCD at times. PTSD, sometimes it's when we think it's their OCD can go along with several other sorts of mental health disorders, and it's important to understand that we don't have a cause of OCD right now, right?
Oh,
So,
wow.
when we think about this, we know this as clinicians, that even understanding the cause of something doesn't necessarily determine the cure. So with OCD, they found different sorts of correlates. They found differences in brain structure, genetic components, even a history of trauma. But we don't know exactly what causes OCD. And that's really important, because sometimes when people have OCD, they want to know, well, what was this thing in my childhood that caused it? Or what was, they want to look to the singular event that precipitated it. But sometimes there is a history of trauma, sometimes there's not. Sometimes they're just different correlates of OCD. So it's important to understand that as well.
Yeah, I was on the phone yesterday with a very well-known world researcher, and he's someone who we were talking about OCD and EMDR, and he had mentioned how OCD, and I use EMDR for a lot of things. I won't go down this rabbit hole too much, but as far as how you would treat OCD, he had mentioned how it doesn't have a target memory. So typically when you have trauma, there's a touchstone experience. A touchstone experience is sort of the earliest entry point of that negative moment. And so with OCD, it's we can't target it, we can't pinpoint it the same way. And so that's interesting that you said that, because you're sort of confirming what he had said. How is this connected with religious scrupulosity?
Right. So religious scrupulosity is a subset of OCD. It's a type of manifestation of OCD. There are different themes with OCD, and people's themes can change over time. So in clients I've worked with, they might have started out with fears, urges, thoughts, and images about contamination. That it might go to symmetry, needing to have things lined up a specific way or arranged in a certain way. Then sometimes it can move to where people may start out with having religious scrupulosity. And what that is the recurrent urges or thoughts or images are centered around one's religion. And so people who experience this may have these intrusive thoughts about, what if I committed blasphemy? What if I'm not going to heaven? What if I'm going to hell? What if I did something that I can't remember that God can't forgive? In terms of thoughts, blasphemous images that they said that people say that they cannot get out of their mind no matter how much they try. Blasphemous words. In terms of urges, being afraid they're going to shout out profanities in church, or do something that would cause them shame, maybe take off their clothes in church, or or punch somebody in church. Anytime they're in a religious setting, is causing a great deal of anxiety because they're afraid they're going to somehow cause a spiritual violation. And so when we think about the compulsions, it may be repetitive prayers, and the prayers may have to be prayed a certain way. And if they're not, well, they have to start all over again. Um, it might be things like counting, avoiding certain types of numbers. Sometimes when we see compulsions, we may see leaning in too much to the religion or just avoiding it completely. So being afraid to listen to the Bible, any sort of religious text, because they're afraid they're going to blurt out something or think something bad. Or avoiding church services. For some people, it's avoiding communion. People think about that verse that talks about if you take communion in an unworthy way, you can get sick or even die. So some people, that becomes a point of focus, and they will avoid communion. And so I like to think of OCD. I've actually heard this from somebody else who's an expert in the field that said that when people deal with religious scrupulosity, OCD is wearing the cloak of religion. And so it is
Hmm.
disguising itself under the good and the good of religion, right? So people love their faith. Oftentimes when people are in these situations experiencing religious scrupulosity, they are very devoted, right? It was said that John Bunyan and Martin Luther experienced religious scrupulosity, and they had symptoms of it. I don't know, I can't diagnose them, but that's what has been said with just some of the behaviors that they engaged in. OCD tends to attack what we love. And so for people who are
Wow.
religiously devout, that can be an issue. I'm going to confession all the time, feeling a need to confess everything. So, oh my goodness, I had this thought. Well, I have to confess this thought. Um, I had this dream, so I have to tell somebody this dream. There's always that looking for reassurance, right? So am I saved? Am I going to heaven? Are you sure I'm going to heaven? Well, I know I'm going to heaven now, but what if I did something I can't remember? What if I'm going to do something in the future? So there's that constant need for reassurance from others as well.
This is why I love having experts. Because I think for some of us listening right now, you may want to diagnose yourself. And I always want to be careful about self-diagnosing. I think I think it's important to start the process of insight. At the same time, for those listening, I think this could be a great conversation starter, a great moment to begin the process of asking different questions, maybe questions we've been too afraid to ask. And just I come back to being enslaved to precision. I'm wondering, because when we look at some of the characteristics that are common between, characteristics that we see within Christians, and then those that we see with those who struggle with OCD, and you may have already answered this actually, but are there any characteristics that are common between Christians and those who struggle with OCD?
Yes, I think it's that it's something that's really common to um, the concept of religion, right? And just how it's abstract. There's certain things that we can't measure. There's always going to
Mm.
be a degree of perhaps uncertainty that is just a part of the human experience that can be amplified in religion, right? How do we measure how much faith we have? How do we quantify whether we've confessed our sins enough? You see what I mean? And so that there probably is, in my opinion, I think there are certain subsets of Christians that have difficulty with that concept. If you, I'll give you an example. So if you think about of OCD in general, people who have, we all deal with intrusive and unwanted thoughts. They did a study and I think they found that 97% of the population admitted to having unwanted thoughts, and they listed all these taboo thoughts that people had. I think it's more that, maybe people didn't want to admit it. But with OCD, the mind looks at those, it gives equal importance to intrusive thoughts and thoughts we want, right? So if we think about our mind as like an inbox, if for someone who doesn't have OCD, the intrusive, unwanted thoughts, urges, and images are sent to the spam folder. But with people who have OCD, it's staying in that inbox and it's treated with equal importance, even more importance, right? Because, oh, this is a bad thought. And this bad thought may define who I am. right? And so they have to zero in right on that thought because we have to get rid of it because it's a bad thought. And so that's when that vicious cycle comes in because if I told you for the next 30 seconds, I don't want you to think about, you can think about anything else you want, but do not think about panda bears, Kyle. Okay, don't think about panda bears,
You're killing me.
right? What are you going to think about for the next 30 seconds? You're going to think about, you're going to try, maybe you'll be successful for 2 seconds, but you're going to think about panda bears even more than you would have if I didn't bring that up, right?
Absolutely.
And it's the same thing with OCD and these unwanted thoughts. Because they're thoughts, urges, or images, because they're taboo and because we're not supposed to be thinking about them, the more we try to suppress them and just stop it or whatever, which doesn't work for people who have OCD. We think about them even more, and that's what is causing so much distress. And then because we can think when there are other areas are of course very distressing, but we think about our religion, that's very personal. Our faith determines our eternal future. So when someone is in constant torment, believing that they may have done something that will cause them to go to hell, or they have to do things in a certain way to secure their eternal salvation. You talked about being enslaved to precision. That can be, with our religion, that's a whole other realm, and it's very important, but it's also, it's part of it is unseen, right? Part of it is we have to work out our own faith. It depends on faith, and when we have these anxious feelings that are so real, that can be easier to analyze and make decisions about than what is unseen, perhaps, or how God sees us. Well, God sees us a certain way, but because we feel so anxious and so rotten and so full of shame, that's what we see and that's what we latch on to. So especially when we think about just the tenets of our faith, we are taught that our thoughts, especially with people who have OCD, and even in Christianity, there's this over emphasis and sometimes assigning too much importance to thoughts, right? We have all sorts of thoughts every day. People may walk by, maybe they're in Niagara Falls and someone may think, oh, well, I wonder what would happen if I just jumped off, right? And that's done. People often have these types of thoughts when they're looking over a high place, but for somebody who has OCD or is prone to this, they think, oh my goodness, what if I'm suicidal? Or what if I'm homicidal? Or what if there's something wrong with me? And they're thinking about that over and over and over again and trying to get reassurance that they're not going to harm themselves or others, instead of just looking at it like, hey, it's a thought. Our brains are thought generating machines, and we think about all these things all the time. And so with OCD, there's this overvaluation of the importance of the fact that you thought a thought, or you saw an image, or you had an urge, something like that you didn't want, but oh my goodness, what does this say about me? What does it say about my faith?
So I have a question. How might someone, and then I'm going to get into treatment approaches here in just a moment. So I'll read Philippians 3:13. Brothers and sisters, I do not consider myself to have attained this. Instead, I am single-minded, forgetting the things that are behind and reaching out for the things that are ahead. And then it says here in Philippians 4:8, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is worthy of respect, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is commendable, if something is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. So my question would be, if I have OCD and I'm a Christian and I read those scriptures, leave whatever it is behind, strain towards what lies ahead, or think about such things, how might my corrupted or my impulses to whatever, how might that affect how I read those scriptures?
That's a great question, and it's someone who is reading those verses who has maybe perhaps OCD tendencies or has OCD, and has this religious scrupulosity form of it. They might now start to doubt if they truly are a Christian because they didn't think about only those things. It's almost like taking these verses and taking it to the extreme. Though, because I thought about somebody that I didn't like the other day and I was upset with them about what they did, or I saw somebody stab somebody on a TV show and now that thought has come into my mind, then that means that I'm not saved, or I have a dirty mind, or I'm a bad person. And we have to realize that we can we have, in terms of the control we have over our thoughts, and this is a debate that goes back and forth. Do we have control over what we think? And what we can do is we can surround ourselves and put ourselves in certain environments where certain thoughts may or may not be more likely to come up. But it's how somebody is, in going back to your question, how is someone interpreting the fact that they're not thinking about those things all the time, right? Nobody thinks about those things all the time. If we look in the Bible has people recording murder, violence, all these other things. So clearly that's not something that people are going to do all the time. Those verses are telling us, what are we focusing on? And so I like to think about it in this way, that, our minds are kind of like security cameras, and we can, we're going to scan, and we're going to have these different thoughts from time to time, but what are we zeroing in on, and what are we panning in on? And the problem with OCD is that when someone is trying to not think certain things, they're going to think about them even more. And so it becomes a negative cycle, right? Someone is thinking, oh, I didn't think about this, let me try not to think about this, and then they're just going to end up thinking about it even more. And that's really the challenging part. And so that's how sometimes people can misinterpret this, because they think that because their experience isn't 100% of this, that they are flawed, they are bad, and it now says something about their character and their eternal destination. I'm not saying that our thoughts are not important. They are, but we need to be careful and wise in how we interpret these scriptures.
Very, very briefly, I'm curious, how do you think, and just very briefly, that the pandemic has affected scrupulosity in people, or OCD in people?
I've noticed, just in my work, that people took time, the being away from church for some people was, it fed into that avoidance of religious themes, right? So for some people who have scrupulosity, they are not wanting to be in a church setting because they're afraid of yelling out something blasphemous or thinking blasphemous thoughts. Anything religious is going to be a trigger for them. And so for some people, it has been where they don't want to go back, right? The pandemic was making things easy for them to avoid these challenging environments. And so that's one for some people who were not able to do things in a particular way. Maybe they weren't able to meet in person to take communion, or maybe some of the rituals and compulsions that they were doing, kind of leaning too much into the religiosity. Because they weren't able to do that, then there were more fears and more anxiety about, well, am I saved? Am I truly a believer? So it's in general, it's just been tough. And then just the stress of the pandemic, the isolation that people have been feeling, and just the overall stress can just make things worse for people in general, and just make the symptoms harder to cope with.
Well, before I get into what approaches are helpful, I just want to say you guys need to go and subscribe to her YouTube channel. I usually have people who do books, or people who aren't necessarily having a YouTube channel, but in this moment I have someone who actually has a YouTube channel. So go to Skill Set Counseling on YouTube and hit subscribe, check out her videos, and she's got some really, really good content on there. And I just wanted to put a plug in because I'm subscribed.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
They can also go to my website, skillsetcounseling.com, and you can see the same content as well as some other information too. So thank you.
So approaches, what's effective?
Well, for OCD in general, exposure response prevention is the gold standard non-medical treatment for that. And so, before, we think about therapies changed over the years, and before we would just, the therapy paradigm would either tell people to relax away the anxiety and, just try and breathe through things, to try and achieve a state of relaxation. Or just like we talked about before, just stop thinking about something, right? So an old technique would be taking a rubber band around your wrist and snapping that rubber band every time you thought of something you weren't supposed to think of, or you had an obsession or a compulsion. But we found that that doesn't work. And so with ERP, it's known as exposure and response prevention therapy. And what this does is it helps change our fundamental relationship with uncertainty, right? Uncertainty is part of what we do every day. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen 5 minutes from now or an hour from now. We even though we want certainty and we like certainty, ultimately we are not in 100% control. But people who have OCD understandably have a really challenging time with that and are trying to get control through certainty. ERP works in this way. So the exposure part helps address the obsessions, right? And so with OCD, there is a huge component of avoidance, avoiding what triggers the obsessions and the compulsions, right? Because these things are time consuming, and so you don't want to be in situations that are going to trigger your OCD behavior. So exposure targets the obsessions. And so that works by, if someone, for instance, is really concerned about going to church, part of our exposure may just be looking at a picture of a church for a while, right? Or maybe watching a little bit of a sermon online, something like that, to help get you in that position where you are exposed to what makes you feel the most anxious. And when that happens, when we think about challenging emotions, anxiety, shame, disgust, they rarely ever stay at the same intensity forever, right? I mean, they just don't. There's no way physiologically we can stay anxious at a level of 10 for days, right? Think about a time where you were really angry at someone. That anger subsided probably within a few hours. You may still have been angry, but the intensity decreased, right? So same with anxiety. But the thing is, when someone has OCD, understandably, that anxiety or whatever that challenging emotion is, shame or disgust, is so overwhelming that we do a compulsion right away to squelch it. But if we put the compulsions on hold for a while, it teaches us that, look, this anxiety, this shame, this disgust, it's not going to kill us. It's not all consuming. It will decrease over time. It will either decrease over time or we will learn to ride the storm. And so that's where the response prevention comes in. Okay. And so instead of, let's say someone is in a situation where they touch something dirty and they have to wash their hands right away, we're going to not wash our hands for maybe 10 seconds and imagine the dirt and imagine the germs until that anxiety comes down. We've ridden through that storm, and that teaches you to look. Anxiety is, or shame or disgust or whatever it is, those really challenging feelings, we can survive feeling them. Because compulsions come in. When you do a compulsion, you teach yourself, I can't handle anxiety. I can't handle shame. I can't handle disgust. I can't handle this feeling of things not being right. I can't handle this feeling that I might go to hell or I might have done something bad. And so you have to have this compulsion. But response prevention replaces that compulsion. And you're not going to do that. Instead, you're going to sit with that feeling, or you're going to do something else. It might be buying a communion wafer and maybe just looking at it for a while, or maybe touching it. We have something that's known as a hierarchy. And so we list our triggers, what causes us the most intensity of the emotions, and we work our way up the pyramid. And so we started with what's the least distressing and work our way up. But the important thing with ERP is it shows us how to change our relationship with how we view uncertainty and all these challenging emotions, and understand they're not going to consume us. But I can tell you that, or we can learn that through actually doing the exercises together.
Well, it's almost like what you're saying, and we find this to be true, is that it takes experience to change experience. Right?
Yes.
Some of this stuff is more caught than taught. And so we put people in a situation, and, it's kind of like, so for our listeners for a moment, when people come to, healthcare providers, mental health professionals, they want to feel better now. And we want them to feel better. And so there can be anxiety about how quickly we can do that. One of the things I tell people is that there's state work and trait work. So state work is what she was talking about, your inability to get in and out of your state. So on a scale of 1 to 10, You get flooded, let's say you're at a 6, and it's your ability to get yourself down to a 2 or a 1. And that's important, right? So that state work, the trait work is changing the relationship. You're talking about with, I just love how you put this, our relationship with certainty. That comes after we figure out, and I love how you talk about the body and this very much somatic part. Like I really like the body, because if you don't move it in the body, you don't move it. So my thing is, so the state work, we've got that. In other words, guys, I know you want to feel better, but your window of tolerance, it has to widen enough to be able to do the trait work, which is now we change the relationship with the association, how the association is stored in the body. And the body is the one that, the body's the place where the associations are really stored. And this is kind of interesting. When you help people, what kinds of sensations, like with OCD, is it like this totally embodied experience of like they feel the anxiety everywhere? Are there certain locations, and do you help them to work with that in certain ways? Kind of interested in that piece.
Yeah, I want you to feel all the hard feels and all the difficult feels when you're doing this, because people, it's interesting when people start out, sometimes they'll tell me they're not feeling anything, right? So we may do something, for instance, if someone has, maybe they don't want to, maybe they're very concerned about blasphemy against like the Holy Spirit. So any kind of songs with the word holy or spirit, and they're like, I can't listen to that. Right. And so, so we may listen to something, we may read verses a lot about the Holy Spirit. But when I ask them, where are you feeling it? Oftentimes you have to realize that OCD, when people are engaging OCD behaviors, are doing the best they can to survive. So people oftentimes will kind of visualize something else to neutralize that discomfort. So they might be reading it out loud with me, but they might be thinking about being on a beach or something to kind of block that sensation. And so it's good when you are feeling like, oh, my hands are shaking. I feel something in my stomach. I feel it in my heart. I feel my hands and feet tingling, because that shows that you're actually allowing the full sensations of discomfort to come through so that you can feel them. You see what I mean? So that is, so because people can kind of cheat through ERP. So if we're doing something where you're visualizing something, I want you to visualize everything. I don't want you to try and block anything out or relax the anxiety away, because you need to understand that even though my body feels horrible right now, I feel like I can't take it. At the end of our exercise, what happened? You made it, right? And so clients will tell me things like, hey, I'm capable. I can handle this. I did it. I made it. At the beginning, I didn't think I could do it, but I did. And so that, what you talked about is really important. People really feel it everywhere, but sometimes because they're doing the compulsions, they've done the compulsions for so long, things can get hardwired in the brain, and they have a way of just kind of shutting out enough of the anxiety where they can make it through the day. It's a compensatory mechanism. So we want to take all that away to really let you get immersed in it and to feel it and understand that even though you feel like you are being consumed by the waves of anxiety and shame and disgust, it will eventually pass, or you will ride the storm. And you'll make it. Whatever that feared outcome is either didn't happen or it did happen and you were okay with it.
So I want to bring up a real life example before you give some sort of resources or whatever. And he wouldn't mind me actually saying this. I've got a friend who preached recently within the last few months, and he talked about, he's actually shared his testimony at conferences, Christian counseling conferences. And so what he had talked about is he had these curse words that would blare in his mind, and he just, like you talked about avoidance and shutdown and suppression, he engaged it to a point where he became suicidal. And so he had a provider that he was seeing, and the woman had said, well, what if you just allow yourself to say it? He's like, no, I can't do that. No, you don't understand. It is blasphemous. Like, I want to curse at God, or I want to say things that are completely uncouth or whatever. I mean, unsavory stuff. She's like, but what if you did it? Turns out, I don't know how, but through prayer, he literally allowed himself to say the most toxic whatever stuff, And he said that after that, it was gone.
Yeah.
And I'm like, is that like really? Like, I'm like, you mean like if it can do its thing, then you can unburden that part of you? Like, really?
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah.
I'm asking though. I mean, genuinely speaking, like in your experience, if you give permission to people who are deeply religious to do things that feel deeply irreligious,
Yes.
has that been cathartic for people?
Yeah. It's not so much, it's interesting because we always, ethically we always have to respect what the boundaries are with people. So some people would say, what are you willing to do, right? And so it's not so much a catharsis, I would say, but just understanding that that yes, I did this. We have to, like I said, we have to be respectful of where people are coming from in terms of their, religion and their faith. But there are lines that you get close to through ERP, and what ends up with so it may be something. Trying to just think of like different examples, but for some people it may be certain numbers or looking at something or reading something, and what is the feared outcome in their mind that's going to happen. And then when they realize that, okay, I did this and there was no feared outcome. So for instance, taking communion, right? So we're not going to take, when we take communion, we're going to say the standard prayer, and then you're going to take communion. For somebody, that could be blasphemous then, because no, they need to rehearse for hours to do this. They need to do whatever they need to do. But we're saying, okay, look, we're just going to do the standard here, and you're going to take the communion. And so for them, that is showing that, look, I did this. It's like I said, changing your relationship with uncertainty. And so every practitioner can have their own way of dealing with the client, but with their client, and it has to be mutually agreed for them. But I would say that the outcome is always, well, yes, I did it. I got, I did this. I crossed that line, so to speak, whatever that imaginary line is in that person's head. And either the feared outcome didn't occur, or it did occur and they were okay with it. And so that's really what we get in terms of religion. It could be, it's challenging because when we think about religious scrupulosity, it's our eternal salvation on the line. And so it's teaching people, do you have to be 100% certain that you are going to heaven before you read the Bible or go to church or do this? And by having people do these exercises, they learn, no, I don't have to be. That quest for certainty is impossible. And the more I try to feed into it, the more I'm being robbed of my relationship with God. I hope what I said makes sense, because I know I answered your question.
No, that was really, I mean, no, seriously, that was excellent. And I think, again, we're talking about some pretty deep circuitry within people. And so there, maybe there's an exposure tool or, a mechanism that works a certain way for certain people with OCD that maybe with others. I do think, I always like to think of ourselves more relationally than we can imagine. So, there's this part of ourselves that we just fear that God doesn't love, or, that we make God so binary, where it's, you're going to heaven or you're going to hell, and it's moment to moment, right? Yeah. What I'm understanding of what you're saying is that for these people, they are, pulled into the orbit, like wholesale, of I'm constantly going to hell, but maybe there's brief moments where I'm not. And the stakes are so high all the time about all the things that I'm anxious about. And so I'm like, wow, that's kind of what I thought of, like the, people who, like OCD and Christianity. I think sometimes things are just on a knife's edge.
Yes.
And you never know where you stand, and it's moment to moment. And so that's kind of what I'm taking home, is that the stakes are really high here.
They are, and I think that's what can be. It's, on one hand, because the stakes are so high, it can be very challenging, but then on the other hand, it can be very rewarding when you see people that, when we understand that, when I say it can be rewarding, when someone, goes through treatment, and when they understand that, yes, my feelings are real, my feelings are important, but, I don't have to, when it's just so rewarding for clients and for practitioners when we see people reestablish their relationship, reestablish their relationship with their faith, things that they avoided for so long that they can do now, and they realize that yes, maybe I had a bad thought in church, or maybe I did this, but I'm not going to run away from my faith. I'm not going to avoid. I'm not going to avoid what was drawing me closer to Jesus before. Because a lot of times when people are experiencing scrupulosity, it's this irony that they're putting in more and more effort either into leaning into their faith in ways that are very scrupulous or avoiding, and there's so much energy, but they're feeling even more distant from God, right?
Wow.
And so, understanding that yes, I'm going to make the choice to proceed with my faith and proceed with going to church and reading my Bible. I'm not going to get stuck on a certain passage and try and find all these verses that will confirm whether or not I'm going to heaven, but I'm going to immerse myself in this relationship I have with God, despite the voices or the feelings that I have that are telling me I'm not going to heaven, because there's always going to be both, right? And we don't want to have this agenda of we're just going to get rid of everything, because for some people, they don't get the obsessions may not go away, but how they relate to those obsessions, those doubts, does. Their relationship to that changes, their response to it changes.
Any resources you want to recommend for those who want to research this further?
Yes, definitely. So there's the IOCDF website, international. So let me just, so IOCDF.org is one website. And then also Ted Witzig is a pastor, and he does a lot with religious scrupulosity. And his website, if you go to accounseling.org, his name is Ted Witzig Jr., and he has lots of videos on religious scrupulosity. And then I mentioned IOCDF.org before. There's the International OCD Foundation.org. And so those are resources. I also have, openings, and I work with clients who have OCD. So you can also just go to my website and book a free 10-minute consultation with me. So we can do that as well. I'm, licensed in Georgia and Michigan, but there are also about 30 other states I can work with through an interjurisdictional telehealth compact. And so depending on where you are, that's a possibility. But those resources, especially on Ted Witzig Jr.'s website, are great. There's several videos on religious scrupulosity and just, understanding our relationship, our relationship between, our relationship with Jesus Christ, and how we are dealing with anxiety and OCD symptoms. He does an excellent job in just breaking everything down.
Yeah, this is very, very needed. And honestly, this is not something that a lot of people are talking about. And sometimes I love these niche subjects, because you end up finding out that there's a whole subset of folks who are like a forgotten or an invisible tribe, but they are suffering mightily. Yeah. And so I just really, really want to thank you for being willing to help tackle this and give people a conversation starter, and giving people even potentially availability on your end for helping them, because I think people are more desperate than they're leading on. I know sometimes I get desperate, or I feel trapped, or I feel stuck, and in those moments we need resources desperately. So I just want to thank you for coming on today. Your time is valuable, your time is precious, your skills are in demand, and we are with you, and God is for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. And remember, there's like a message that you sent to other. You've mentioned that people feel alone and people feel that overwhelmed. Like, you are not alone. I wanted to tell anyone who's listening, you are not alone. There's there are other people that are dealing with it, that have dealt with it, that have gotten better. So I would just urge you to just get treatment, get help as soon as you can if you feel like this applies to you, because people oftentimes wait so long, and it's just, don't hide in shame. They're people, they're practitioners like myself who understand exactly what you're going through and are ready and willing and able to help you. So
for those of you who have watched the entire video, many of you do, I want to thank you. I will make sure to put what she had talked about in terms of the links and resources. I'll make sure that makes it into the description. And I am really excited about the content we've got coming up. As the polls you guys have filled them out, I have started working on those interviews. as it relates to church hurts and women's roles and those things. I mean, you guys, what you guys are struggling with and what you want covered, I'm listening and I hear you, and I'm going to make sure I'm going to do my best to get those interviews for you. I'll see you next time.